All right. Well, good morning, and good morning. Just kind of settling on in. Whoa, alive and well and doing good. Okay, let's see. It's the November tape. You are there, Edward R. Murrow. Hey, well, um, I've got such a gigantic grin going across my face. I'm just sitting here smiling. Um, Complete blank in terms of thinking. I'm just having such a great time doing nothing here. But I'm sure I'm welling into it. This morning, when I popped up, I had thought, well, you got a November tape, you got a December tape. What can you really say? Because from what I can tell, this will probably end the consciousness series, because changing someone to the business, therefore the tapes will change and become other things. I think. Who knows? Being in the moment, and you've learned that. So, as I progress, as you progress, as tapes progress, and as I got up this morning, which was kind of unusual, I had actually two insights if I were going to do November and December. And one of them being this tape, and because I'm having so much fun, it's just a joy gig. This tape I had considered doing on marriages and relationships, and relationships to ourselves, relationships to our partners, pictures, concepts, ideas, all the different things, that I could probably wrap up into this without making it, as usual, male or female. The reason that I have chose relationships, as you know, I did a videotape on relationships, which I found tremendous, just absolutely tremendous. And so this is an audio tape on relationships. Now, you could be sitting out there saying, well, what would Dennis have to know about relationships? The man's never had one. And if he's never had one in that form, not being the married relationship, he's had tons of apparently other relationships being single up until, the age of 47. And, what would he really know about relationships? So I figured I'd start out with something simple about, I think that in terms of relationships, a single person probably knows a fair amount, as does an individual who has been in a relationship most of their life. However, two complete different perspectives. As I grew up, naturally, I'm going to give you my perspective of relationships. As I grew up single, and then had to have relationships with everybody. Also, being with ladies from time to time, and working and seeing relationships as they would work differently throughout, from the time you date until you're 47 years old. You have a wide span of input, different than, per se, the married individual who is working with relationship with their partner, and then working with relationships with the rest of the world, but from their partnership point of view outwardly. For me, it was a singular aspect, working with relationships with each individual and the collective, and also woods relationships. In other words, when I was in the woods, my relationship was with animal, vegetable, mineral, and people, of course, but you're looking at terms of years with relationships strictly with different aspects of nature. And so in terms of relationships, pulling in those 8 years there and, trying to work with figuring like everybody else did, let's just start at 18, because your relationships from 18 weren't really designed for, a more serious aspect. They weren't really designed for sex and all that stuff. So kind of, I started out like with you, relationships from 18 to, then whenever you guys would get married, or those of you who would stay single. But I figure that as a single person, I've got some really good insights on it. And so the first insight that I want to share is that the relationships that I wish to talk about are not necessarily designed with your mate in mind. Okay? Now, for those of you who were married, therefore, a lot of your attention went to that avenue, whereas with a single person, I had to deal with other avenues of relationships. Now, the first relationship that I observed that I needed to get worked on was the God one. I knew that somehow, between myself, there was nothing else other than something that I chose to call God. And that in the world that I existed in, I could see people, I could see places, and I could see things. But I noticed that all those things constantly changed, and that you could never really actually count on any one of those things. Now, I also knew that even though I couldn't see it physically, there was something called God. I went with that evaluation based on the fact that I was alive. I went on that based on the fact that somehow within me, I knew there was more going on than what I could actually just see and understand. And so I knew there was God, and then I knew there was me. It was the only two things that I trusted that I could count on. I also knew that as I studied different individuals, as they studied different relationships, and let's just say like Einstein and Edison and Bell, Freud, Jung, people who had relationships with their science or their perspective. In other words, like some people have relationships with their mate. These people had a relationship with science that was, or themselves, or like Madame Blavatsky. They had a relationship that went beyond physical because they got something that nobody else on the planet seemed to be getting. Along with that, I put all the great saints. Okay, so this is where I started from. My relationship first was with me and God. Now, I didn't know shit about me because I was too young on the planet to really know anything, and that I could understand. Because I could tell that just within 18 years, and as the years started to compile into the 20s and into the 30s and into the 40s, how massively you changed your understanding of yourself. Which means that the relationship that you have with yourself is changing so rapidly that there is no real one solid truth that you can actually count on. Because as you become more and more aware, like you start really taking in things that you used to judge as really terrible, that now you're just perceiving from a non-judgmental state. See? Okay, well, at 18 and working through all those years, I knew that relationship with the self was something that was going to change. So I figured, rather than start working on the self first, because I didn't have enough time on the planet, I started working on the relationship with God. Now, some of the relationship was conscious, some of it was unconscious. The nature part was totally, I would say, unconscious, but conscious. In other words, I felt that that I have always been divinely guided. Come on, something showed you how to at least make your brain figure out how to work your fingers when you were a little kid. Do you know what I mean? Go back to the time that you were a baby. Something helped show you how to figure out how to move your fingers, move your toes, move your hands. Some sort of awareness helped you. Do you know what I mean? And so I always figured that was there. So that's what I always counted on. Okay, so I figured I had to have a relationship with something. So I wanted it with God. All right. Now, I went for nature because God turned me off. Okay? By being raised a Catholic, I got God, but it wasn't working for me because it was like, a punishing condemnation, you were screwed kind of a thing. So that because it wasn't really working. So I rejected the God. But on the subconscious plane, what I meant was I tried to observe how the universe worked. Okay, so we call it people watching, or oh, we love to do this so that we can observe people do their thing. Okay, this is how we chose to understand how the essence worked. Now, the essence were people, and we acknowledged that. We said we were people watchers. Okay, or we learned in other different ways. That was just a quick example off the top of my head. Okay, so we're taking in knowledge that would help somehow qualify, who knows, whatever God may be. All right, now, I'm taking in the understanding of nature, which I only got to see years after I was actually starting to work with it. So that's what I started with. By the time I got into the woods, I was finally mature enough in age, linear time on the planet, to start to understand that I had to have this relationship going on with God. Now, in the meantime, we're all working on relationships with ourselves, with our parents, with people, with our surroundings. I'm not talking about those relationships, okay? I'm talking about the relationships, like the inner aspect, the thing that keeps us fighting for life till the last moment, trying to figure out what is going on. What are we really here for other than everything that we've been told? Okay, that part. Now, here we are. We're out there in the woods. I'm just talking about myself, me and God. And slowly, I noticed that nature is the quality, the first quality that I can really understand. That outside of myself, I can count on. Now, I want you to understand how basic this is. The elements, earth, leaves, green things, animals, trees, the wind, storm, heat, cold. Okay, nature. I started by understanding each one of those things because I was part of each one of those things, and they were the only thing real outside of myself. I noticed that I could drink the water, and I stayed alive. I noticed that I could eat the green things, and I stayed alive. I noticed that I could stand on the earth and the minerals. I noticed that I could ingest certain earth and minerals and get certain effects in my body. I could understand that the other creatures, the animals, I could eat and continue to survive. When it rained, my body went through unusual changes. When it was too hot, my body went through unusual changes. When it got cold, my body went through unusual changes. When things went into my body, things had to come out of my body. My body went through changes. Slowly I began to make a relationship with each of these things. And each of these things is so very important to you in your understanding of how it all works. When you, let me give you an example, live in the woods and you're making a fire, it does a lot of things for you. Each twig that I would pick up, each stick that I would pick up, I would bless it, I would thank it. And I would never pick up too many sticks or not enough sticks. I would always pick up exactly what I knew was right. And it always worked out. I began to observe that I honored the stick and that I began to understand what that little stick that laid there could give to me. If I got it small enough, I could clean my teeth with it, and I could make it small enough, and if it was a hard enough thing, I could actually, use it as a form of a needle and weave things. I could turn it into a flame and give me warmth. I could weave small ones together and make baskets. Millions of uses all of a sudden for one little tiny piece of wood, or the bark that was on the wood for weaving and things of that nature. And you begin to see your relationship with a little piece of wood. All of a sudden you see how it warms you and how it takes care of you and how it nurtures you, and all of a sudden it has like a major consciousness. Like, wow, it houses people. It holds up dwellings. It is really an amazing thing. And you begin to understand your relationship with it and what it does for you and how unique that is. Now, I know this sounds simple, but every time I lean against a tree and I'm in the present moment, I can commune with that tree while I'm doing everything else. Just by touching a different piece of wood in my hand as I go down a banister or anything, I know what kind of wood it is, I know what it feels like, and I have a relationship with it, and my hand says hello to it. Everything in my being acknowledges every form of wood 24 hours a day that it comes in contact with. If I bump into a door, excuse me, door, wow, I see your pine. How's your day? Pine is really good in the orange fields, and you've really helped me a lot of times in that way. And all of that flashes within a zillionth of a second because you're in the present moment. And you and the door, even though you bumped into it, take a moment out of your busy day to say hello to each other. You see, because each split second in time really does mean something. And if you have a relationship with that something, you are constantly aware of all of the millennium of things happening within every split second of the day. And so you have a relationship with all of the wood that you come in contact with throughout the day. All of the water that you drink, or that you see in a puddle, or that you splash, or that freezes in the snow, or whatever, you have a relationship 24 hours a day with it. I have that relationship with everything in nature. I have that relationship with metal. I have that relationship with everything. Example, somebody gets in the car. You all have your car. If somebody treats it wrongly or somebody treats it roughly, don't you say something to that person to be aware of the car? You give the car that state of consciousness. For me, what it is, it's more than the car. It's the metal, it's the lining, it's the stitching, it's the cotton. It's all of those things because you identify all of it, not just car. And when you honor your car, or you honor all the different parts of it, you are honoring yourself because you know that that's your relationship. You don't abuse it, you don't hurt it. There's no need to. If it needs to do something for you, like, say, be destroyed in a fire because you need warmth from it, because you make no judgment of it, and because you have the perfect relationship with it, it destroys itself to help you. And it turns itself, it doesn't really destroy itself, it turns itself into another format of energy for you, another aspect of the divine, of nature to serve you. So it's never really even destroying itself. So when you get a flow with nature, you will find that you have no judgment. Sometimes you can relax by putting your feet up on certain things, and sometimes that would be uncomfortable if it were another substance that you put your feet up on. And you have a flow with nature, and you know the proper thing to do at the proper time. You do not put your feet up on crystal furniture. You have an awareness that would not be proper, and you give that respect to the host. Sometimes you should give, all the times you should give that respect to nature. It is there to serve you. How would you treat it back? As it serves you. And so slowly, I got my relationship up with nature. From nature, I began to realize that nature was God. You see, by watching nature, I noticed that I didn't have to judge nature. I could understand how it actually worked, and I could understand how that was within a divine realm, within a divine understanding, which gave me my interlocking of my relationship between me and God, which is the first relationship, the most important relationship. Okay, now, taking it into the next step. Excuse me, I just had to cough there. Okay, taking it into the next step. Now, when I look at nature on a massive scale, okay, remember, I told you I was going to keep people out of this in terms of the understanding of how relationships work so that you can understand how the world serves you and how you serve the world back. Okay, now, I began to observe that sometimes the universe would have major calamities. Okay, now weather calamities. This is nature. This is natural. Okay, this is the one part that I know I can trust. I know that those storms are going to come along. I know that devastation is going to happen. I know that earthquakes do this. And I know that nature had to do this because I also know that a long time ago, nature was just this molten mass of, of hot rock that eventually had water and eventually had land, and, and turned into this thing, and that it will continue to do that evolutionary process. And that nature has been here for millions and millions of years, and you can count on it. I also noticed that sometimes, I came from the Midwest, Cleveland, and so like tornadoes were the happening thing there, and they would come through towns in Cleveland a lot. And I noticed that they would just tear up these trailer parks, and they would just tear out massive amounts of houses, and they'd spin these trees, and they'd do all this damage, and it was like, it just so happened that where the path of the tornado went, it just so happened nobody was in those houses. They were all out in the garage, the thing that didn't get lifted up. The tornado just missed it by, 2 inches, and that, nobody really got hurt. And of course, I would pay attention to it all over the world because I would also see, Bangladesh and things of that nature. And I would see where massive populations got wiped out. But I also began to notice that massive populations got wiped out where nature continuously did that particular violent action, but people keep going back to that particular violent space. And so I began to figure that, well, apparently these people are into understanding this particular aspect of nature. I also noticed that in certain places, nature would take her revenge out on the planet, but nobody would get hurt. And I just figured that the people who were in those places, they were there where nature spilled out her energy, but they were also there to understand that there would be no pain to them. So I began to notice that nature could do two things. She could hurt a lot of people, and she could not hurt. I noticed that she was consistent in certain areas and not consistent in other areas. And that where she wasn't necessarily consistent, nobody got hurt. But where she was consistent, people really, would take a pounding. And I also noticed the mentality of the individual also had a lot to do with it. And as the individual's mentality went up, certain areas that continuously took normal pounding, the mentality was able to avoid the calamity. So that nature was still there in her rough mode, but if the intellect was also there, it was able to understand and deal with. So I observed three different forces. I observed nature in her raw force, where she just devastated land continuously and people continuously. I noticed nature where it continued to be a devastating point, where mankind's intelligence raised, it was able to deal with nature. And they shared, coexisted. I also noticed that nature, in her limitless power, would do her damage without interfering with individuals. And I noticed that those individuals were also of a higher thought value. I began to understand how nature acted just by observing those examples, and beginning to understand how each worked within itself, and how the perfect people were always at the perfect place, and that nature did her perfect thing continuously, and that there were certain things you could count on. That God I was able to count on, and I was able to bring it deeper and deeper inside of myself. And over the years, as I began to understand how this relationship worked, I began to expand into what is called the paranormal, or the more divine path, or the metaphysics, or the, whatever you choose to call it. And within this understanding of God, I began to notice that there was understandings that were around, that people had put together in their relationship with God. And I began to see that they all interplayed and interlocked. And so I began to see that through nature and through God, all things on the planet, especially through the individuals who made themselves known, there seemed to be this thing, this relationship with God, that once you began to understand it and not judge it, you began to accelerate in a very unusual way in states of clarity which other people seem to believe were divine. Or that you were a genius in a specific category, or you were brilliant within this, or that you had such a state of creativity. You didn't have to have the mind, see, you just needed creativity. There was always something special about each individual who chose to build a relationship. God is the most important relationships, and actually God gets this whole side of the tape. So that relationship with God and nature is one that I could really work on, and I could see how nature and myself, through using these examples, could interplay and understand. Living in the woods helped me understand them even more. I began to learn how to use the dirt for different things, the air for different things, fire for different things, ice for different things. And it's amazing how the universe can truly support you in anything that you want, within any endeavor. And if you can go into the woods and live all that time without any other people around, let's just say 5, 6, 7 months without anything around but just you and nature, and you can get in a perfect flow where everything just serves you and you serve it equally, then I truly believe you can do that with a zillion people around you and a zillion different situations just as easily. Because if you can get your relationship with yourself and God going, which means non-judgment, you can deal with any other relationship that's going on, because all those other relationships that you have with your family, your wife, your husband, your children, your daughters, your sons, other people, with your house, with your cars, with your yards, with your situations. See, if you use all of these different aspects to understand God, not to fight with, not to struggle with, not to be separate from. You use all these things in your effect to get to God understanding. You share with your wife or husband, understand God. Not to go out there and work together and build a house together, or buy a house together, or have a car. You're working together to understand your life, your essence, your divinity, that thing that is deep within inside of you. That's what this relationship is about. We'll get to the pointers on how to do that with your mates and stuff, but first you have to understand that this relationship is with God, see? If you stop judging God, you'll stop judging your mate and all the surroundings and all the children and everything else. Because you'll begin to see how your mate and how your kids and how your house and how your car and how all these other things work, just like how nature works. How nature works with this group of people, how nature works with that group of people, how nature works with this other group of people, and how you, as people, work within all of these natural things. And if you're really built from the earth, how does that earthly part really work? How do you and nature really flow? So the things that look like they were magical aren't magical. They're just you understanding nature. They're just understanding how you flow. Yeah, that's what it's just really all about. And when you discover you don't have to judge these things, you will discover that you will stop your judgments on people, places, and things. Because you will begin to see the God that is within all these things, instead of trying to, from the physical plane up, discover how all of these things mechanically work so that you can mechanically get your way to God. See, the physical unit is doing that, while the God part is bringing itself down in other ways. Everything combines together for an overall knowledge. See how that works? So while you're working on your way trying to mechanically figure it out, the God space, through nature and non-judgment, is helping you get a handle on it. Because if you can understand nature and non-judgment, then you will find that will reflect in your everyday life, which is people, places, and things. So it's really understanding your relationship with nature. Do you treat nature right? Do you treat it the way it should be treated? I mean, think about it. I think about almost every grain of sand that passes underneath my foot as I take every single step. Did I abuse that twig that I just stepped on? Did I treat that leaf properly? Did I actually stomp down on it because I was having a bad day? Or did I just gently admire it for what it was and then step on it and understand there was no problems with that? You see, that's how aware you can be in every moment. I'm aware that the tape is coming to an end, so let's just continue over onto the other side. Thank you.